Falco. I'm at home today, but thank you for being a little bit flexible. We had a couple delays, so we're an hour off of normal schedule, but I do have those questions. So if you have more questions, please feel free to comment them in, and I will do my best to answer them. But the questions that we have today about DesignShop are kind of based around pull compensation and how, when, why, all that kind of good stuff. And then also about kind of creating these other elements around a design. So I have this flower design, and I want to put it on an applique, and I want that applique to go all the way around it. Well, that's very much kind of the same approach that we would use for creating a primer stitch. So Samantha has done videos previously on creating primer stitches. Same process, slightly different application. So we'll look at that as well. Okay, so let's get over to get over to DesignShop. There we go. Okay, so the first thing we're going to look at is pull compensation. How, why, what, all that kind of good stuff. So I'm going to start with just, I apologize, I do this all the time, but it's the best example I can think of for this, and that is a circle. So if I have a circle, and I'm going to just quickly, good morning, put a border around it, or maybe afternoon. It's getting close to noon, so I'm not sure where y'all are. I'm going to put a border around it. I'm going to go change element type. I'm going to say add, and I'm going to do just a walk bean so we can see it really clearly. I'm going to add that, and let's change that to purple. All right, so I'm going to zoom in here. Now, if I were to sew this, chances are, well, duplicate this over here. So let's say this is what I digitized. Chances are this is what I'm going to get when I sew out. It's probably going to look something more like this, right? Like this, the edges come in. They just pull in, but they also push the opposite direction. So I might even end up, let's do not that. Funny when your decimal point moves. You're probably going to end up with something a little bit closer to this, where your sides pull in a little bit, and then your edges push the opposite direction. So I'm going to draw vector lines so we know what I'm talking about. Remember what I'm doing. So depending on your stitch lines, they'll push in this way, or pardon me, they'll pull in this way, and then they'll kind of extend up this way. And what do I do to combat that? Well, backing, right? The more stable my material is, the less this type of thing is going to happen. Also, underlay. So you can see this has a good bit of underlay under it. That would help. But what we'll also do is, and this is why things on screen don't, if they look good on screen, they may not look as good when they sew out. If I distort them a little bit on screen, it's going to help the sew out. So that's what pull compensation is for. So if I right click and I go to properties, wow, that's really big on screen. Get that down to a little bit more size. If I go into pull comp, that's what that stands for, is pull compensation. I can extend those stitch lines, so when they pull in, they'll pull to where I think they should be. And this always takes a sew out or two for me. And there's two ways to go about it. You have pull compensation, which deals in a percentage, and that's a percentage of the entire stitch line. Or you have pull offset, which deals honestly with addition. The points that I put on there, it extends either side of that stitch line out that direction. So let's do both. So I'm going to duplicate that again. So this is what we don't want. This is what we started with. I'm going to duplicate that again, and I'm going to move down, and we'll do it twice. Down again. All right, so that fit this. Normally have my stuff on a different resolution, and so when I'm casting to you guys, I change it and stuff moves. All right, so let's go back into properties and let's look at pull compensation. So I'm going to go into pull comp and I'm going to say add 10%. So I'm going to type 110. So that's 110% of whatever that stitch line is. I'm going to hit apply. See right away that, zooming in and out on you, it affects the longer areas far more quickly than the shorter areas. So that's how pull compensation works. And in theory, that should work well, right? Like the longer stitches are going to pull harder than the shorter stitches. Okay, so we just got a question in. I'm having problems with a satin stitch. When I try to stitch it out, the needle just stays in one place and makes a big mess. I have theories on that. I'm going to have to come back to that. I don't think it's related to this, but I will try to come back in and address that and try to figure out how to do that on the screen. We'll get that sorted. Give me a moment to think about that one. But I think I know what's happening. Okay, so longer areas pull harder. So if you're compensating for the pull of stitches, pull compensation as a percentage can work for you. I tend to do a little differently. I tend to affect everything a little more evenly. With all the underlay and of course good stabilization, I tend to need things a little bit less drastic and a little more even. And so I tend to go with pull offset. So if I'm going to go say I need things less drastic, and then I'm going to go up 5 points, which is really drastic. But it makes it easier to see on screen when I'm showing this stuff. So what this does is if I take ruler and I measure from where that wireframe line is out, I've zoomed in enough to actually be accurate, it would be 5 points. So it does it to each side of that line. So, but what's nice about it is it does it everywhere evenly. So as I extend that out, every stitch line is getting extended by that amount. Here, measure across 5 points. So pull compensation does it by multiplication, whatever that whole stitch line is. So if you have a big fill that goes all the way across your design, it's got one long stitch line that whole way, it's really going to multiply that out and get really, really big. So again, I tend to go pull offset. It does things a little more evenly. New one, and let's do something really bad. So I'm going to grab an older alphabet. Diane script. I'm not going to grab that because I've changed things. Never mind. Let's grab this one. Grab that one either. Sorry, this is what happens when I go in and I start changing my files to give them to engineering, and then I forget that I've done that. Do this one. So this one's a pretty nice little typeface, but if I wanted to make this really, really small, I come in here and I measure from here to here. That is from here to here. That's 7 points. So that's the diameter of most of the needles that we sew with, right? Like a 7511 needle is 7.5 points in diameter. So that stitch isn't the size of, so my needle, that's not going to work so well. So what a lot of people did when pull offset wasn't available is they would use pull compensation to make it thick enough to sew so that your stitches were bigger than the needle that they were sewing with, or could handle the material that you were on, or whatever. So if I wanted to do that, I could do that here. I can do this again twice because things once. So if I measure, and I would measure my thinnest points, usually that's kind of here-ish or here-ish, and I've got 6 or 7 points. If I wanted, so let's say it was 6 points. If I wanted that to be thick enough to sew, I need it to be 10 points, ideally, or maybe even 12 points. So if I were to do that with pull compensation, 6 points is what it is. I need it to be 10 to 12 points. What do I need to multiply that by? Well, that's 100%. And that gets a little, it'll sew out, but it gets a little marshmallow-esque. Is the word that I tend to use for that. If I do it with pull offset, I'm adding to each side, right? So I have 6 points, maybe 7 if I'm lucky, but let's say 6, and I want to go to 10 or 12. I go, to make it the same, let's say I wanted to go to 12. I would add 6 plus 3 on one side and 3 on the other. So I add 3 points of pull offset, and this is now thick enough to sew without giving me a thread break, but it's not closing in as much. Look at the negative space inside. The O is really kind of closing in, the E's really closing in, and the M, it just, yeah. This is a nicer way to make small lettering thick enough to sew and still get, a nice sew out without thread breaks. Here's another place where pull offset differs from pull compensation. If you look at how this M was created, it has a column coming up here, and then this little guy, and then a column coming down here, and then there's this like end. Well, the end right here is kind of a cap, and this is much wider than the two pieces that meet it. So if I'm adding pull offset, it's extending those stitch lines out. Those stitch lines will be even on the way up. If I'm using pull compensation, you'll get these kind of funny things where it sticks out all of a sudden because this is so much wider than this. When you do that by multiplication, that's going to extend just that much farther. So that's kind of the big difference between pull offset, pull compensation. There's another place where that cap kind of sticks out. Pull compensation was really handy in the day. It got me through a lot of kind of sticky situations. Pull offset is what I tend to use, honestly, since they put it in the software. I use it almost exclusively when I'm making things thick enough to sew, or when I really am compensating for the pull of stitches. So both of those approaches will work. One just tends to work a little better in a broader spectrum of. All right, since I have this up here and it's just going to be easier for me. Sure. Another question that came about, and I'm just kind of trying to create some artwork real quick because I'm quite prepared to do this since things shifted last minute. One of the questions was, if I have a design and I want to put something around it or create a shape for it. The question was based around, I want an applique that kind of mimics the shape of what I'm doing, but is bigger than that. Samantha has done this with primer stitch. She's done it with luggage tags or or key fobs, very similar kind of things. Those videos are out there to consume at your leisure, but we'll kind of go over the same kinds of things and a couple of different ways to approach that issue. So if I wanted, how big is that? Yeah, it's big. Okay. So I'm going to just change this lettering into a fill, and I did that with change element type. I just had it selected. I held control and clicked on a fill. So I now have just complex fill lettering. It's up here. This is, I need you to pretend with me now that this is a design that I purchased or I digitized, and now I need to create this outline, this other element to kind of encase, envelop, whatever, this lettering. How do I do that? Well, there's a few ways to approach it. Depending on the level of your software, you can do a few different things. If it's wireframe, you can do what I just did and change element type, convert it to a complex fill, but add it, not replace it. In this case, I'm just going to duplicate it since I've really paid first time. I'm going to change colors so you can see what I'm doing a little bit. Once I have that, I can manipulate those complex fills. You can do it as a complex fill. A lot of times, I'll do it as a vector fill because then it's not processing stitches every time I turn around. So maybe we do that. Maybe we change element type to a vector fill. If you don't have vector, that's okay. You can use complex fills and do very similar things. I'm going to go to Object and Offset Outline. And I'm kind of making a guess. I'm going to go 40 points. And that's close. I may do that again. I think I want a little bit more. I'm going to just go, I think that much again. There. That's pretty good. So now I'm going to grab all of these. So click on one, hold, I'm holding shift, click on the other. And then once you have those selected, you'll have combine elements. And then you can go in and if I'm doing applique, do I really want to do all these little fiddly bits? Or do I really want to come in here, deal with this hole? No. I'm going to select the element, select the hole, and then hit delete. That's going to make that hole go away. I don't really want to cut into here the way this is doing it, so I'm just going to edit this shape a touch. Something that's a little, honestly, here to place. So once you have that, that's kind of the basis. And I can then either use change element type or digitize around it or whatever, but this is the shape that I would need to begin to create my pull inside the E. No, I don't want that. Too little for me to even select that way, so I got to go into the wireframe list to find it. Are you? There you are. Delete. Out. If you want to simplify things a little bit more, if it's a vector shape, you can even double click on it, go into properties, and you can simplify that shape by how much you smooth those curves. So you can see, if I went to the left, I got a lot of points. If I go to the right, I get far fewer. I want fewer because I want simpler. And I may even go in and delete a few of these myself because if I just don't want to deal with them, I won't. All right, so I have this. I want to create a walk stitch, I can either digitize around it, or again, I can use change element type. This is a level dependent feature, but it's one that I use a ton, especially in demos like this to kind of speed things up. But I will go ahead and replace that. So now I have just a walk stitch. And that would be, so if I was doing an applique, that would be my locator stitch. Then what I would do is, again, this is partly why I love this tool. I'm going to change element type again. I'm going to go to single line and I'm going to add. So I add that single line. Then I'm going to go into properties for it. What the single line will do, it's going to be my tack down stitch. So I have my locator stitch, that's where I want my fabric to be, and I'll probably, honestly, I will either save that out as an SVG to send to a cutter, or I will sew that out on a piece of material and cut that out ahead of time, or I may lay my material down, sew it out, and then cut it out. I'm just rubbish at that because I end up cutting my garment. We got a couple more questions coming in. I will get to those in a moment. So for tack down stitches, the trick is I want to tack them down as quickly as possible without shifting fabric. I'm going to go to a tackle stitch. That works well for me. So one question is, how do I easily do a zigzag stitch like a walk stitch? I do a single line and I just change my stitch type to tackle. So that's what I do. I use change element type to do it. A lot of times, or if I'm just digitizing, if I'm digitizing around it, I don't have change element type. I just grab single line and I digitize around my shape. Realize I'm kind of way out here, but you get the idea. Then I hit enter. And now it's asking for a width. Enter again. And then I would just grab properties of this. So grab that element, right click, go to properties. I go to top stitching and I set to tag. What's nice about the single line element is I can change, with that single line element, I can change how thick it is. So I like a little more wiggle room with my tack down. So I'm going to take that up to 30 points. I'm also going to change how it deals with these corners. So I'm going to go into my corners. I'm going to turn on a miter, so miter style 1, it comes down, splits that. For tack down and for traditional tackle twill, I tend to use a style 2. And I tend to kick it in a little more frequently. I'll change that to 120 degrees, just so it hits a little more frequently. So now that's looking a little bit more like a traditional tackle stitch, or tack down. Where I have had 2 cups of coffee. The other really nice thing about dealing with things in properties like this is if you get one element the way that you like it, you can go into properties, you can copy those properties, and now let's deal with this. I'm going to paste those properties. So my properties got pasted. Now I've got some kind of funny stuff in here. I don't really like this. This needs a bit of editing. So I'm going to delete that point. I'm going to bring this down just a touch, so it kind of rides along that walk stitch. And I've got this here to deal with as well. Anytime I have a wireframe point inside where that corner is going to be, it's not going to end well for me. I'm going to delete that, and then it forms that corner for me. Good, Kelsey said that answered her question. All right, so I'm going to delete that. That's going to cause that corner to form. Other things, so I've got all this going in here, almost. Delete that. That is a bit of a problem when you are converting and combining, and you tend to get a few more little fiddly bits that you have to go back in and edit. But right now I've got my tack down, or my locator. I'm going to change the color. That way I have a different color block so I can make the machine stop and wait for me before it just tacks things down. So always make sure that your locator and your tack down are 2 different colors. The other thing I like to do is I like to change where this falls. So go into my properties. I'm going to go into single line. I'm going to change this. Taking bets. I always get it wrong the first time. Unless I'm on camera. So I like to have it a little bit more on the inside than on the outside. And then I will change my width for my cover stitch as well. Now, if you guys see that you're starting to generate these kind of funny travel stitches, I don't really want to go around everything twice. If I move my entry point, notice that my travel stitch just went away. I don't know if you guys go back, if I can generate it again. So I've got this crazy, it's going to go all the way around the design, and that's going to move my fabric, and I don't want to do that. So I'm going to move my entry point just a touch. It's going to get rid of that travel stitch. And then let's make sure that my corners are doing what I want them to. So when do they kick in? How does that work? Go back in properties. That's under corners. Now I have it set pretty extreme. So I have it set to 120 degrees. Now that is to mimic a traditional tackle stitch where it is on a traditional sewing machine. It is a zigzag. It's going back and forth, back and forth. They come to a corner, they put the needle down, they pull the presser foot up, they rotate everything, and then they go back down and start sewing. So there's no tapering, there's none of that, right? You just go to the corner, turn, go. And so your stitches aren't turning, they actually turn at the corner in a completely different direction. So that's why you start seeing things like this. And that's a very traditional look. If you want to back that off, you can change it. I think the default right now is 75. So that will fan through a corner. Being old school for tack down, that just makes me a little twitchy, but it's not that big of a deal. If it's going to get covered up by a satin stitch, it super doesn't matter. If you're generating really long or really odd corners, kind of kick this up. That might help you with that. Now, if you wanted to cover this up with a satin stitch, you wanted to cover it up, you could duplicate it again. And then I like to change the width. And so I'm dealing with things, sorry, I'm hopping into properties and I'm changing things, and I'm going to the property bar and I'm changing things, just whatever's fastest for you. So I changed that to 40 to give myself a little bit more wiggle room. The other thing that I tend to do, I'm going to go back into properties. So what I just did, this and this, the exact same. Same as density here, as density here, stitch type, stitch type. It's just where you want to grab the information. I'm going to go back into my single line. I'm going to change this. Let's see if I can get you a better view of it. I like for my cover stitch to do 80-20. No, I have that backwards. I like for my cover stitch to be 75-25. I like for my tack down to be 80-20. There. So what that does is it kind of evens up the edges a bit where it falls. Is that absolutely critical? Absolutely not. Could I do 75-25 for both? Sure. 80-25 or 80-20 for both? Yes. This is just how I prefer to do it. And especially so laser cut, blade cut, roll and cut, whatever. Those are nice and precise and clean. I can get away with smaller margins. If I'm hand cutting things, I increase that width, right? So the 40, that's for me hand cutting. If I get really precise with it, I can go down to a 30 for my cover stitch and a 25 for my tackle, and get away with tighter edges on it. Oh, I was changing this to satin stitch, give it a nice satin stitch cover. And then for the corners on a satin stitch, I will either miter it with a style 1, and for this one I will back off to 75 degrees, which is typically the default for that. go into 3D so that I can see how those corners are looking. And you can either do a cap or a miter. Sometimes I do both. So if it's really tiny, I do a cap. If it's bigger, I do a miter. But I think that's going to work fairly well for me. This is a bit extreme. If you don't like that, you can. Sometimes I'll get ones that are just so extreme that I will, honestly, I'll leave the single line up here and just digitize over it with a column too, so that I can craft the corners to be little weird curvy corners or whatever, but I'll use kind of that single line as my base art. So that was a lot of work, right? Like I did the walk, I did the tack down, and then I did the cover stitch to create my applique. And if I was digitizing around the whole thing, it would be a little bit more work even yet. Now, depending on the level of your software, you can be a little bit more efficient with how you run your business, and you can use the Applique tool. Applique tool is located under complex fills. It's the little heart, and whatever you digitize, crazy curvy whatevers, there we go. It does all three things at the same time. And it also works. Duplicate that and bring. For change element type, I still need to go in and tweak some of these corners, right? Because they're just too extreme. But if I right click and I go to properties, I've got my properties for my locator stitch. There's my stitch length, tack down, who I want it to be. Some people prefer lighter. Some people prefer an E stitch, so it's like a blanket stitch that goes. And you can add a color change between your tack down and your cover. I like doing that because hide that. I like doing that because what it'll do is allow me to stop the machine. So you can see that east, so it goes around the edge and comes in. But I like having my tack down and my cover stitch as different colors. That way I can put another applique stop in on my machine so that if it shifted during the tack down, I can correct it. Or if I have a piece hanging out, I can kind of trim it up very carefully before that cover stitch goes over. It just gives me, I'm a nervous embroiderer sometimes, and especially with fiddly pieces like applique, I tend to like to double check myself. So having those two as separate color blocks, that can alleviate that. All right. Okay, so let me scroll back up and see. Got a question in OS. That's gonna be a little tricky for me at the moment, but I'll see what I can swing. Satin stitches, let's start with that one, and then we'll do random or. Oh, so this goes back to, sorry, I should have read this earlier. This goes back to the pull offset, pull compensation, and is it, if I do a random, so in the fill, do I still have that? Yes. So let's go into 3D so we can see kind of the pattern a little bit easier. The question is, at least I think this is the question, if I do a random either patternless or offset or a non-traditional kind of step fill, does it not pull as hard? And I wish that was the case, but I've yet to come up with a way to make it not pull as hard when you've got really long stitches. So no, a fill may pull slightly less hard than a satin, but it's marginal. It's still something. It's just embroidery. It's just something that you kind of have to deal with. Okay, so really long satins. It doesn't say really long satins. I'm guessing really long satins. It says having a problem with satins, doing a satin stitch when it tries to stitch out. It just stays in one place and makes a big mess. So, either I don't think this is the case. Not saying I've never done something like this, but hoping this isn't the case for you. Either you didn't really get the hoop arms clicked in, so the hoop arms are moving and the hoop's not. Or it came out of the hoop, so the garment's not moving, but the hoop is. That'll make it not move and make a huge mess. What I have seen happen, and this gets really kind of nasty. If you have a really long satin stitch and it's in a stitch file format, so instead of being an OFM where it's the wireframe, it's got all expanded, right? There is a setting that if it's over, now I lost it. If it's over a half inch, I was thinking it was a quarter. If it's over a half an inch, it will drop a jump stitch inside the expanded file for really long satin. And I know that makes a lot of nonsense to who already has no idea what I'm talking about. Unless you see it, it just makes no. So let me see if I can make it happen. Go into properties. I'm going to have to disable this to make it happen. So 0 disables that fill stitches for, or use fill for stitch lines greater than a certain amount. If you put 0 in there, disable it so it's satin. You'll see us do this for 3D foam. Now I do this. Oh, go wider. It's almost there. Now it's there. So what I'm doing is I'm going over 127 points. And let's save this here. Goofy satin. Okay, so let's save it there, and then let's save the EXP so you can see what's going on. And then I got to make DesignShop do a few things so I can pull it up and see what's going on. I'm going to go to Tools, Options. What I'm looking for is Expanded Open. Now there's a similar setting in OS. And this is, I should have saved that to a DST. Expanded files can contain trims, DSTs can't, so they go to jumps. And here's what determines it, right? So jumps per trim, let's go 6. But also, it will sync in a jump stitch to assist machines, not our machines, but older machines. It would have a jump in there to give it another chance to move, to kind of move the thread and keep everything looking nice. Longer than half an inch. 27 points. Half an inch. If I open that back up, I look at the expanded stitches, especially where it's getting towards the end. Yep, here we go. So what we're looking at is we have stitch, jump, stitch, jump. So it back and forth, and there's a jump in between every one. Well, close this. If I change this filter to 1, because I've been dealing with stitch files where there was only one jump for every trim, and I needed it to trim like between letters or things like that, that's just going to chew up. So when you get to this point, there's no more stitches here, right? Because it just stays here and tries to trim, and it just makes a giant giant mess. So by changing that number back up past what you have between those stitches, something like a 3, in this case even a 2 would work, that will hopefully alleviate that big mess that you're seeing. I hope that's my best guess as to what that issue would be. So many hellos. And yes, Linda, this time I was late, but everybody was. All right. Go back up. Sure I didn't miss anything else. Big mess. I think that's the trouble with the big mess. Random and non-standard fills. I wish that would help, but it doesn't really help for me. And then Actifeed. Let me see if I can make that. Let me see if I can get that going. Half a second to see if I can get everything hooked up real quick and see if I can. I don't know that it's gonna help without running something, but see what I can swing. Give me a second. I've got to go turn the machine on. And then while that's doing its thing, please explain Actifeed on OS. I don't understand the status it's showing. Is it showing that I should bump up or down the points per the graph line? Okay, so I can maybe even do this without OS. Here. Let's actually digitize the graph. Work. So in OS, there's a blue there's like a blue graph and then kind of a white line going across it as you saw. And it kind of looks like a heart rate monitor, not as much as I just made it look like. Realized what I was thinking. Wait. Anyway, it comes across like this. That's in blue and you can't see it. Shows up in white. Something like this. Okay. So Actifeed is how much thread the machine is feeding, right? And it's always listening to kind of what's going on in the fabric with the thread. That's what that little bar kind of that you loop the thread under. It's hitting that. It's listening to rhythm and the pressure and all the things that are super technical, and I barely understand it when the engineers talk to me about it. What I do understand is, you know, what do I need to do and what do I need to look for in adjusting it, and kind of what is it telling me, right? So if I'm seeing it be really kind of erratic, that could be a few different things to me. That could be I have my minimum set too low. Up, yeah. Nope. Okay. So it either means it means that my minimum is quite possibly set too low. So it's having to jump up to do what it needs to do and then tries to just do the bare minimum. It could be that I hooped really poorly. I know that sounds weird, but as it shows, if I'm getting a lot of flagging, that thread kind of goes back up into the system. Like there's just a lot of slack there, which kind of can freak out that sensor a little bit, and that can give you some issues as well. Typically what I'm looking for is I want to feed enough so that my graph does not look like this. Right? Like this is, occasionally that's fine, but if I see that a lot, it's not good. And I especially don't want to be seeing, you know, like this kind of craziness. That's not ideal, especially a bunch of that. Not ideal. What I'm looking for is maybe this, where, oh, I just went over the second half of this, where I just went over something that I sewed already, come back over. Like the flatter it is, kind of the better off I am, the more even my stitches are going to be. And an occasional bump is what I'm looking for. So relatively smooth and then an occasional bump. I'm kind of where I am. What I need to make sure of is that I have my bobbin tension set correctly for my machine type or my hook type. That's kind of in those the manuals, the specifications, and how far it should drop and all that kind of stuff. Make sure that I clean it out before I do that, because otherwise I'm going to be testing and getting some weird results, right? But I need to make sure that I hoop well, I have good stabilizer, I've got my bobbin set correctly, and then I'm looking for kind of that nice even sew out, and then I'll pay attention to if the machine starts giving me a lot of false breaks, then my thread feed's probably a little too high, and that graph is probably just totally flat. And I say the flatter the better, right? But totally flat, not so great. That means I'm not getting a lot of feedback. I'm not reacting to what's really going on. So I want just a smooth line with an occasional little, just a little blip here and there. Okay, so many things coming in. Interesting, Darren. Thank you. Was saying maybe with the satin stitch not going anywhere, making a big mess, maybe that's a bird's nest. So yeah, double check if it's oh, now we're getting into a few things. So myself in so much trouble in these live sessions. So if you have really long stitches and you're not greased those upper rollers in a while, it can cause the thread to walk out to the side and give you a bird's nest, which will make the fabric not move and give you a huge mess. So make sure your bobbin tension's correct. Make sure that those are, if you notice that it's walked out to the side and that's what's causing that mess, that could be another issue too. Double check that those have been lubricated appropriately. And then make sure as you're doing that, as you're looking at it, make sure that the three little kind of pronged feet on the inside of those little red or black rollers, depending on what machine you have, make sure that they're not broken. If they're broken, it can wobble and not work, right? So then the thread can walk out and give you all kinds of there too. But yeah, those are my best guesses. The upgrade, yeah. So speaking of Actifeed, depending on the version of software, the newest version of software that is out there right now, you may see those Actifeed numbers being a little bit higher than earlier versions. And they've gone in and measured and micro calipered and tried to get it as close to as real as possible. So that's possibly why you're that as well. Okay. Photofill. I have a good example. Okay. See if I can find one real quick. There's a question on photofill. Suppose I can take one of the ones that's in the graphics folder. That'll work. so yeah, guessing high school by now. Okay, so first thing, I just bring in a photo. Now, the photos that are going to work better, like if we were to screenshot me right now, this would be, right now it would kind of work because I have light here versus kind of dark back here, so I get some separation. If I lean this way, I'm okay because it's a little bit lighter here. But if I kind of lean this way and I would my whole would disappear. The whole side of my face would disappear into the edge of that window. So that's not ideal. What you want is something that's going to separate from the background and have kind of a decent amount of contrast. This is a little too much. I'm sorry, the light is really brutal today. But then I turn into a silhouette if I do that. So. Okay, so let's go back. All right, so next I want to then go to select it, right click on it, go to photo fill, and this is a level dependent feature as well. And then the next thing that I tend to do doesn't go quite in the order that I do. I choose my element size. So this, I mean, you could think about it in terms of pixels. Like that makes sense to you. The bigger the element, kind of the lower resolution you're going to get, the kind of blockier everything's going to be. So the smaller the element, the higher the detail. But the more stitches you're going to have. So choose your element size, and then I would choose my output size. How big do I want this to be? Let's go close to 5 by 5. And then do you want a border around it? That I like it, cleans up the edges. And then I tend to leave all of this alone for the first time, just to see how things kind of turn out. And now we have it done in Photo Stitch. It's done in essentially what would be shades of gray. This works on light with dark stitching. And that's going to work best. If this isn't, the details aren't quite what you want, can delete that, go back into the photo, do it again. And you can change, you can adjust it here, and change how it's processing. Okay, now it processed a little bit different. And what I like about this one is her shirt is not as blown out. Now on other elements I don't mind, but if there's a spot where it's just a flat line going across, the lightest it can be, on faces it tends to blow out and just look gone. So I try to get at least one little bump on stuff in a face. So you can see that again, and as you kind of step back from it, you can process. And then obviously, the smaller the element, the bigger and try that again. Smaller your elements are and the bigger the overall size is, the more detail you're going to get. So here, I have a lot more detail, but you have a lot more stitches. So just be aware of that. Can you do it in color? Yeah. That again. If I go to color, this looks terrible because it's not in the appropriate colors. And the appropriate colors are documented. Never remember what they are, so I'm just gonna go down and grab. I think it should, and the order matters. Yellow first. I think. I have to look at it. May go in cyan, yellow, and magenta, but I always have to play with it before I figure it out. Yeah, that's super not right. I think so. Yeah, okay. So the blue should be magenta. Yeah, the blue should be magenta. And magenta should have been cyan. And then it's a little rough on screen and you get a moire pattern. Trying to see it, it sews out really well. That may still have, I may have these two reversed as well. I may have the yellow and magenta. So I gotta look that up. I apologize. And then if you wanted to do something a little bit different, you can, if you wanted to sew white thread on a black ground, you could go into an image editing software, invert the colors, which makes it look like a photo negative, and then process that, and then just swap your thread and your background. So you could sew white thread on a dark ground. Can I go in and edit the stitches? Well, I could. Problem is, they're expanded, so it's into how bad do I want it. They're all expanded elements. So I'd have to go in and edit each individual. So you can, it's just not my favorite thing. Other good points. Apparently, I haven't had the coffee that I thought I had. On Actifeed, the presser foot makes a huge difference as well. Make sure your presser foot is adjusted. Thank you, Darren. Make sure that it's adjusted. Otherwise, again, you're going to get that flagging, and that's going to cause you some issues with that feedback into the system. All right. I think that's it for every. No, there was something on circles that I just missed. Hold on. Oh, no, I did. Got it. Okay. Hopefully that answers some of your questions. If you have more, please let us know. What stitch am I using? For the photo fill, it's its own stitch. For tack downs, I use a tackle. For cover stitch, I use satin. I hope that answers that question. If you have more questions, let us know at applications@melco.com or continue to comment in and we'll check back in with these. Thank you so much, and